Picture this. A 19-year-old girl sits chained to a wooden block in a cold stone fortress. She has never committed murder. She has never stolen. She has never harmed an innocent soul. Her crime? Claiming to hear the voice of God and wearing men's clothing to protect herself from assault. For this, she will be burned alive in front of thousands of cheering spectators while church officials declare it the will of heaven. This is not a scene from a horror movie. This is the true story of one of history's most evil punishments, carried out by men who called themselves servants of God, while orchestrating what can only be described as legalized torture, disguised as divine justice. Before diving into this forgotten story of cruelty masked as righteousness, if you enjoy learning about the darkest chapters of human history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these haunting stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space, by our shared need to understand how civilized societies can commit such unthinkable acts. To understand why this punishment was so uniquely evil, you have to understand that it wasn't carried out by barbarians or madmen. It was orchestrated by educated clergy, respected bishops, and university scholars who twisted religious law into a weapon of political destruction. This was the execution of Joan of Arc, and it represents something far more terrifying than simple brutality. It was the systematic perversion of justice itself, where the very institutions meant to protect the innocent became the instruments of their torment. The year was 1431, and Joan of Arc was the most valuable prisoner in all of France. She was 19 years old, a peasant girl who had somehow convinced a king to give her an army, and had used that army to drive the English forces back from the gates of Orleans. She had changed the course of the 100 Years' War, turning what seemed like certain French defeat into the possibility of victory. But now she sat in chains, purchased like a piece of property by the English for the staggering sum of 10,000 francs, roughly equivalent to the price of 1,000 war horses. The English didn't buy Joan to execute her quickly. They bought her to destroy her slowly, methodically, and legally. They understood that simply killing her would make her a martyr. Instead, they needed to prove that her victories were not the work of God, but the deceptions of a demon-possessed heretic. They needed to show that the girl who had crowned their enemy was nothing more than a witch deserving of the flames. The man chosen to orchestrate this judicial murder was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon was not some backwoods fanatic. He was a sophisticated political operative who had served as an advisor to the English occupation government. He understood that Joan's trial had to appear legitimate while ensuring her condemnation from the very beginning. He assembled 42 clerics to serve as judges, creating the illusion of a fair ecclesiastical court, while stacking it with men loyal to English interests. On January 3rd, 1431, the formal charges were announced. Joan stood accused of wearing men's clothing in violation of biblical law, claiming to receive divine visions without church approval, and refusing to submit to ecclesiastical authority. These charges seem almost laughably minor by modern standards, but in medieval Europe, they carried the death penalty. The genius of the accusations was their impossibility to defend against. If Joan claimed her visions were real, she was usurping church authority. If she denied them, she was admitting to deceiving the people of France. The interrogations began on February 21st, and they revealed the true nature of this judicial charade. Joan was led into the chapel of Beauvais Castle to face her accusers. She agreed to swear an oath to answer truthfully, but she refused to reveal anything that might compromise King Charles. This simple act of loyalty would be twisted into evidence of her defiance. For over a month, Joan endured nearly a dozen interrogation sessions. The clerics pressed her relentlessly, using techniques designed to trap her regardless of how she answered. When they asked whether she believed she was in a state of grace, They set a theological snare that had destroyed countless heretics before her. Church doctrine held that no mortal could know with certainty whether they possessed God's grace. If she said yes, she contradicted church teaching. If she said no, she admitted her visions were false. Joan's response revealed an intelligence that frustrated her interrogators. She replied that if she was not in a state of grace, she prayed God would place her there. And if she was, she prayed God would keep her there. Even Bishop Cauchon could find no fault with this answer. It was perfectly orthodox, theologically sound, and impossible to use against her. The initial 70 charges were whittled down to 12 articles of accusation as Joan systematically dismantled their case. Her intelligence and theological knowledge began to convince some of the clerics that they were participating in a sham. One tribunal member stepped down entirely, declaring that the testimony was being twisted to entrap Joan rather than seek truth. Another openly challenged Cauchon's right to judge the case and was immediately thrown into prison for his courage. But while Joan was winning the battle of words in the courtroom, she was losing the battle for her life in her cell. Her imprisonment violated every principle of ecclesiastical law and human decency. Canon law required that women accused of heresy be guarded by nuns in church prisons. Joan was held in a military fortress under the direct control of English soldiers who viewed her as their greatest enemy. She was chained to a heavy wooden block even when confined to her cell. Iron shackles were placed on her feet. Guards were assigned to remain inside her cell at all hours, with 3 men stationed inside continuously and 2 more posted outside. Joan had no privacy and no rest from the constant watch of men who despised everything she represented. The guards subjected her to relentless harassment and abuse. They taunted her mercilessly about her capture, her failed mission, and her approaching death. She lived in constant fear, surrounded by enemies who made no secret of their hatred. When she fell seriously ill with fever and believed she might die, she begged to receive the sacraments and to be buried on consecrated ground. Her requests were denied. The Earl of Warwick, who controlled the castle, restrained the guards somewhat, but not out of compassion. The English had paid an enormous sum for Joan, equivalent to the price of 1,000 horses, and they intended to extract full political value from her condemnation. They needed her alive for the trial, but they wanted her broken. The danger Joan faced went far beyond verbal abuse. According to testimony given during her later rehabilitation trial, she faced repeated threats of physical violence and sexual assault during her imprisonment. One witness stated that a great English lord attempted to force himself upon her. This explains why Joan continued to insist on wearing men's clothing despite the charges it brought against her. Men's clothing, tightly bound and laced, provided protection that women's dresses could not offer. Joan argued repeatedly that it was more appropriate to dress as a man when surrounded by male guards than to wear clothing that left her vulnerable to attack. The judges dismissed this reasoning as mere obstinacy, but the threat was devastatingly real. The trial itself was a masterpiece of legal corruption. Joan was interrogated for weeks before being formally read the charges against her. She was given no legal counsel to help navigate the theological complexities of her case. The procedures fell below even the minimal standards expected of inquisitorial courts. The trial took place in Rouen, rather than in Joan's home diocese, a clear violation of canon law designed to ensure she faced hostile judges. Evidence suggests that the trial transcripts were deliberately falsified at crucial points to make Joan's statements appear more incriminating than they actually were. Scribes were ordered to record certain responses in ways that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt, even when Joan's actual words were perfectly orthodox. As spring turned to early summer, the net was closing around the peasant girl who had dared to challenge an empire. The verdict had been predetermined from the moment the English purchased her, but the elaborate legal theatre had to play out to its bitter end. The most evil aspect of Joan's punishment was not simply that she would die, but that her death would be presented as an act of divine justice carried out by holy men serving God's will. The systematic destruction of this 19-year-old girl represents something uniquely horrible in human history. It was evil disguised as righteousness, cruelty dressed in the robes of religious authority, and political murder carried out with the blessing of the church. What makes Joan's punishment so particularly evil is that it perverted the very concept of justice itself, turning the institutions meant to protect the innocent into weapons of their destruction. The stage was set for one of history's most shameful spectacles, where a teenager's faith would be met with flames and her courage would be answered with calculated cruelty. The men who condemned her believed they were saving Christianity from a dangerous heretic. In reality, they were about to commit an act so evil that it would stain their reputations for centuries and transform their victim into an eternal symbol of courage in the face of injustice. The theologians from the University of Paris had spoken. These were not village priests or local clerics, but the most respected religious scholars in Europe. Their verdict was delivered with all the weight of academic authority and divine certainty. Joan's claims to hear the voices of saints were declared to be demonic deceptions. Her wearing of men's clothing was pronounced unnatural and wicked. Her refusal to submit completely to church authority marked her as a dangerous heretic who threatened the very foundations of Christian society. On May 23, 1431, Joan was brought before the tribunal for what everyone knew would be the final time. Bishop Cauchon read the verdict with ceremonial gravity, his voice echoing through the stone chamber. If she would not recant her claims and admit her deceptions, she would be handed over to secular authorities for execution by fire. The threat was not idle. Behind the legal formalities lay the brutal reality of medieval justice. But even faced with this ultimate horror, Joan initially refused to break. She had endured months of imprisonment, harassment, and psychological torture. She had watched as her interrogators twisted her words and perverted her faith. Yet she maintained her defiance, insisting that her voices were real and that her mission had been divinely inspired. The following morning brought a scene designed to shatter her resolve. Joan was dragged from her cell and taken to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, where a massive crowd had gathered to witness her final choice. In the center of the cemetery stood a tall wooden stake, surrounded by bundles of kindling and logs. The sight was meant to terrorize her into submission, and it worked. Faced with the immediate prospect of burning alive, weakened by months of brutal imprisonment, and abandoned by the king she had crowned, Joan finally broke. The 19-year-old girl who had faced down armies could not face the flames. She agreed to sign a document of abjuration, formally recanting her claims and admitting that she had deceived the people of France through false visions and demonic inspiration. The crowd that had gathered to watch her burn was denied their spectacle. Joan's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She was ordered to abandon men's clothing forever and to wear the dress of a penitent woman. She complied, her spirit seemingly crushed by the ordeal. Bishop Cauchon must have felt a moment of satisfaction. The dangerous heretic had been broken without creating a martyr. But Joan's capitulation lasted only a matter of days. When Cauchon and other judges visited her cell shortly after her public recantation, they found her once again dressed in men's clothing. Joan told them she had changed back of her own free will, claiming that the voices of St. Michael, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine had appeared to her in her cell, reproaching her for denying the truth to save her life. The official record states that Joan resumed wearing men's clothing voluntarily, but witnesses who testified years later during her rehabilitation trial told a different story. They claimed that her guards had deliberately stolen her dress during the night, leaving her nothing to wear except the men's clothing. When she awoke, she had no choice but to put on the forbidden garments or remain naked among her male captors. Whether Joan changed clothes voluntarily or was forced into a trap, the result was predetermined. Under canon law, a heretic who relapsed after recanting, could not be given a second chance. On May 28th, Bishop Cauchon and 7 other judges interrogated Joan in her cell one final time. She told them that she had resumed wearing men's clothing because it was necessary for protection while imprisoned among men, and that her saints had censured her for denying the truth. The judges had what they needed. Joan's return to male clothing after swearing not to wear it was legal proof of relapse. On May 29th, the tribunal unanimously agreed that she must be handed over to secular authorities. The sentence was death by burning, and this time there would be no reprieve. The final act of this judicial murder began at dawn on May 30th, 1431. Joan was allowed to receive the sacraments, an act of mercy that technically violated church law since she was condemned as a relapsed heretic. It was a small gesture of humanity in an otherwise merciless proceeding, perhaps granted because some of her judges felt uncomfortable with what they were about to witness. She was then led through the streets of Rouen to the old marketplace, where a massive crowd had gathered. The English had spared no effort in turning her execution into a public spectacle. A tall plastered pillar had been erected in the center of the square, designed to elevate the victim above the crowd so that everyone could witness her final moments. The platform was built deliberately high, not out of mercy, but to prolong the agony by keeping the flames away from her vital organs for as long as possible. Joan was tied to the pillar with heavy ropes that cut into her flesh. She should have been formally handed over to the bailiff of Rouen for secular sentencing, as required by law, but the English took direct control of the proceedings. They wanted to ensure that nothing would interfere with their revenge against the girl who had humiliated their armies. As the executioners prepared the fire below her, Joan made a final request that revealed the depth of her faith, even in the face of unimaginable terror. She asked to see a cross as she died. An English soldier, perhaps moved by her youth and obvious fear, fashioned a simple cross from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She kissed it and pressed it against her chest, finding comfort in the symbol of her Saviour's own suffering. Then a processional crucifix was brought from the nearby church of Saint-Sauveur. Joan embraced it before her hands were bound, and it was held before her eyes as the torches were applied to the kindling below. The flames began slowly, crackling through the dry wood at the base of the pyre. The crowd pressed forward, eager to witness the destruction of the witch who had brought such misery to English ambitions in France. As the fire grew and the heat began to rise, Joan's voice could be heard above the roar of the flames and the noise of the crowd. She cried out repeatedly to her saints, calling on Saint Michael to protect her soul as the fire consumed her body. Witnesses later testified that her voice remained strong and clear, even as the flames reached her. A testament to the unbreakable faith that had sustained her through months of torture and degradation. Her final word, shouted above the growing roar of the fire, was the name of Jesus. At 19 years of age, the peasant girl, who had changed the course of a war, died in the marketplace of Rouen. Her body consumed by flames, lit in the name of God, by men who had perverted justice into an instrument of political murder. The executioners were not finished with their grisly work. After the flames died down and Joan's body was reduced to charred remains, they built the fire again and burned her remains a second time. Then they did it once more, ensuring that nothing recognizable was left. Her ashes were gathered and thrown into the Seine River to prevent anyone from collecting relics or creating a shrine to her memory. The English believed they had erased Joan of Arc from history, that by destroying her body so thoroughly, they could destroy her legend as well. They could not have been more wrong. Instead of silencing her story, they had created one of history's most powerful symbols of courage in the face of overwhelming evil. What makes Joan's punishment uniquely horrific is not simply the physical agony of burning alive, though that was unspeakable enough. It was the complete perversion of every institution that should have protected her. The church that should have been her sanctuary became her prosecutor. the law that should have ensured justice became the instrument of her destruction. The scholars who should have sought truth became the architects of lies. 25 years after her death, Joan's mother successfully petitioned for a rehabilitation trial. The court heard testimony from 115 witnesses, including many who had participated in the original proceedings. The judges declared that the 1431 verdict was invalid, tainted by bias and riddled with procedural errors. They concluded that Joan had died an innocent victim of political persecution disguised as religious justice. But this vindication came too late for the girl who had burned in the marketplace of Rouen. Her punishment stands as one of history's most evil acts precisely because it was carried out by civilized men who convinced themselves they were serving God while orchestrating the torture and murder of an innocent teenager. They transformed faith into a weapon, justice into a sham, and righteousness into the cruelest form of evil imaginable, Abel. The evil of Joan's punishment extends far beyond the flames that consumed her body. It lies in the calculated psychological torture that preceded her death, a methodical campaign designed to break her spirit before destroying her flesh. The men who orchestrated her destruction understood that simply killing her would not achieve their goals. They needed to obliterate the very idea she represented, to prove that divine inspiration could be twisted into demonic possession through clever manipulation of words and fear. Consider the exquisite cruelty of the choice they forced upon her. Joan could maintain her faith and burn, or she could save her life by admitting that everything she believed, everything she had accomplished, everything that gave her existence meaning, was a lie. They offered her survival at the cost of her soul, knowing that for someone of her convictions, this was no choice at all. It was psychological torture, refined to an art form. The English understood something that modern observers often miss. Joan was not dangerous because of her military skills or her tactical genius. She was dangerous because she represented the power of unshakable conviction in the face of overwhelming force. Her very existence proved that a peasant girl could stand against kings, that divine authority could challenge earthly power, that truth could triumph over political convenience. She had to be destroyed not just physically, but spiritually and symbolically. The trial itself was a masterpiece of legal sadism. Every question was designed to create an impossible dilemma. When they asked about her male clothing, they ignored her entirely reasonable explanation that it protected her from assault. When they questioned her visions, they dismissed her theologically sound responses as evasions. When she showed intelligence beyond their expectations, they accused her of being coached by demons. They had created a system where innocence itself became evidence of guilt. The judges who condemned her were not ignorant fanatics driven by superstition. They were educated men who understood exactly what they were doing. Bishop Cauchon held advanced degrees in theology and canon law. The clerics who assisted him were scholars from prestigious universities. They knew they were perverting the very legal system they claimed to serve, twisting religious doctrine into a weapon of political assassination. What makes their actions particularly evil is the way they hid their cruelty behind the mask of divine justice. They convinced themselves and attempted to convince history that they were saving Christianity from a dangerous heretic. In reality, they were committing one of the most unchristian acts imaginable, using the name of God to justify the torture and murder of an innocent girl whose only crime was believing too deeply in the very faith they claimed to defend. The conditions of her imprisonment reveal the systematic nature of their cruelty. Every aspect of her captivity was designed to break her down physically and mentally. The constant surveillance by hostile guards, the chains that prevented rest, the denial of basic human dignity, the threats of violence, all of this was calculated to weaken her resistance before she faced her interrogators each day. They understood that a prisoner weakened by months of abuse would be more likely to make fatal mistakes under questioning. The sexual threats she faced add another layer of evil to her punishment. Her judges knew that she wore men's clothing for protection, yet they made this very act of self-defense into a crime punishable by death. They created a situation where she had to choose between physical safety and legal safety, knowing that either choice could be used to destroy her. It was a trap within a trap, designed by men who understood exactly how vulnerable a young woman would be in their custody. The manipulation of her brief recantation shows the depths of their psychological cruelty. They terrified her into submission by dragging her to the cemetery and showing her the stake where she would burn. When fear finally overcame her courage and she agreed to recant, they must have felt a moment of triumph. But even this victory was not enough for them. They needed her to relapse so they could execute her without the complications that might arise from keeping her alive as a perpetual prisoner. Whether her guards stole her dress to force her back into men's clothing, or whether her own conscience drove her to resume her male attire, the result was the same. Her judges had created conditions that made her relapse almost inevitable. They understood that a person of Joan's convictions could not long endure the self-hatred that comes from denying one's deepest beliefs. They counted on her faith to become the instrument of her destruction. The execution itself was designed as a public spectacle of terror. The English wanted everyone to witness what happened to those who dared to challenge their authority. They built the platform high not out of mercy, but to ensure that Joan's agony would be prolonged and visible to the largest possible audience. They wanted her death to serve as a warning that would echo across France for generations. But perhaps the most evil aspect of her punishment was the way her executioners tried to erase her from history itself. Burning her body 3 times and scattering her ashes was not enough. They attempted to destroy every trace of her existence, to make it as if the peasant girl who had dared to crown a king had never lived at all. They understood that martyrs could be more dangerous than living heroes, so they tried to prevent her from becoming either. The irony is that their very efforts to destroy her memory ensured its preservation. By making her punishment so excessive, so clearly unjust, so obviously motivated by political rather than religious concerns, they guaranteed that future generations would see through their propaganda. They created the very martyr they had tried to prevent, ensuring that Joan's story would be told and retold until the end of time. The evil of Joan's punishment lies not just in what was done to her, but in what her case reveals about human nature itself. It shows how easily educated, civilized people can convince themselves that monstrous acts are justified when they serve their political or personal interests. It demonstrates how institutions designed to protect the innocent can be perverted into instruments of oppression when those who control them prioritize power over principle. Her story reveals the particular evil that comes from the marriage of intelligence and cruelty. These were not ignorant men acting from passion or superstition. They were sophisticated individuals who carefully planned and executed a campaign of psychological and physical torture against a teenager whose only crime was believing she had heard the voice of God. They used their education, their authority, and their understanding of human psychology to inflict suffering that was both calculated and cruel. The rehabilitation trial that eventually cleared her name serves as a final indictment of those who condemned her. When the political winds changed and it became safe to examine her case honestly, witness after witness testified to the irregularities, the bias, and the outright corruption that had characterized her trial. The very men who had participated in her condemnation admitted that they had known at the time that they were participating in a judicial murder. But this later vindication could not undo the evil that had been done. Joan had burned in the marketplace of Rouen, crying out the name of Jesus as the flames consumed her body. Her judges had achieved their immediate political goals, destroying the symbol that had inspired French resistance to English occupation. They had proven that even divine inspiration could be defeated by human cruelty, when that cruelty was systematic, intelligent, and ruthless enough. The legacy of Joan's punishment extends far beyond her individual case. It stands as a warning about what happens when those in authority decide that the ends justify any means. When institutions meant to serve justice become tools of oppression. When the powerful convince themselves that their victims deserve whatever suffering is inflicted upon them. Her story reminds us that the greatest evils in human history are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who have convinced themselves that extraordinary cruelty serves a righteous cause. Use cause. The most chilling aspect of Joan's case is how it established a blueprint for institutional evil that would be replicated countless times throughout history. Her execution was not an aberration or the product of medieval ignorance. It was a carefully crafted template for how civilized societies could systematically destroy inconvenient individuals while maintaining the facade of moral authority. The techniques used against Joan became the standard playbook for political persecution disguised as legal proceedings. Create impossible charges that cannot be defended against. Use psychological pressure to break the victim's resistance. Manipulate the legal process to ensure the desired outcome. Present the final punishment as the inevitable result of divine justice rather than human malice. This formula would be repeated in witch trials, heresy prosecutions, and political purges for centuries to come. What makes Joan's punishment particularly evil is how it perverted the concept of mercy itself. When she briefly recanted to save her life, her judges presented this as an act of divine grace, proof that even the most hardened heretic could be redeemed through the Church's infinite compassion. But this mercy was revealed as another form of cruelty when they made her relapse inevitable through the conditions of her imprisonment. They offered salvation with one hand while ensuring damnation with the other. The psychological sophistication of her tormentors cannot be understated. They understood that breaking Joan's spirit was more important than breaking her body. A martyr who died defiant could inspire others to resistance. A heretic who died broken and abandoned by her own God would serve as a warning that divine inspiration was no match for earthly power. They needed her to die not just in physical agony, but in spiritual despair. Consider the calculated timing of every aspect of her ordeal. The months of imprisonment were not simply about gathering evidence or following legal procedures. They were about wearing down her resistance through constant stress, inadequate food, lack of privacy, and the ever-present threat of violence. By the time she faced her final interrogations, she was already weakened in body and mind, more susceptible to the psychological traps her questioners had prepared. The involvement of respected academic institutions like the University of Paris added a veneer of scholarly legitimacy to what was essentially an elaborate assassination plot. These were not village priests making decisions based on superstition and fear. These were the intellectual elite of medieval Europe, men who understood theology, law, and human psychology. Their participation transformed a political execution into something that appeared to be a reasoned theological judgment. The gender dynamics of Joan's punishment reveal another layer of calculated cruelty. In a society where women were expected to be submissive and silent, Joan's very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural order. She had spoken to kings as an equal, commanded armies, and claimed direct communication with divine authority. Her punishment was designed not just to kill her, but to restore the proper hierarchy that her success had disrupted. The sexual threats she faced were not incidental to her persecution, but central to it. Her judges understood that the constant fear of assault would weaken her psychologically, while simultaneously providing them with a weapon to use against her. When she wore men's clothing for protection, they could charge her with violating divine law. When she wore women's clothing, she became vulnerable to attack. It was a system designed to ensure that any choice she made would contribute to her destruction. The falsification of trial records shows how her persecutors understood the importance of controlling the historical narrative. They knew that future generations would judge their actions, so they carefully crafted a version of events that would justify their cruelty. They presented Joan's intelligent responses as evasions, her theological knowledge as evidence of demonic coaching, and her reasonable requests for protection as signs of stubbornness and pride. The public nature of her execution was crucial to the evil they perpetrated. This was not simply about killing Joan, but about sending a message to anyone who might consider following her example. They wanted every person in France to understand what happened to those who claimed divine authority to challenge earthly power. The spectacle was designed to break not just Joan's body, but the spirit of resistance itself. The prolonged nature of her death reveals the sadistic pleasure her executioners took in her suffering. The high platform was not designed for mercy, but for maximum visibility and prolonged agony. They wanted the crowd to see every moment of her pain, to hear every cry for help, to witness the complete destruction of the girl who had dared to believe she was chosen by God. The attempted erasure of her physical remains shows how her persecutors understood the power of martyrdom. They knew that any trace of her body could become a relic, any site associated with her could become a shrine, any memory of her could inspire others to similar acts of defiance. They tried to eliminate not just Joan herself, but any physical evidence that she had ever existed. But perhaps the most evil aspect of her entire ordeal was how her judges convinced themselves that they were the heroes of the story. They genuinely believed they were saving Christianity from a dangerous heretic, protecting society from a deluded girl who threatened the stability of the social order. This self-righteousness made their cruelty even more complete because it eliminated any possibility of mercy or second thoughts. The rehabilitation trial that eventually cleared her name revealed the full extent of the corruption that had characterized her original prosecution. Witness after witness testified to the bias, the procedural violations, and the outright fabrications that had marked every stage of her case. But this vindication came 25 years too late for the teenager who had died crying out to Jesus as the flames consumed her body. Joan's punishment stands as one of history's most perfect examples of institutional evil because it combined intelligence with cruelty, authority with corruption, and righteousness with revenge. It shows how educated people can convince themselves that the most monstrous acts are justified when they serve their interests, how respected institutions can be perverted into instruments of oppression, and how the language of justice can be used to disguise the most unjust acts imaginable. The evil of what was done to Joan of Arc was not the result of ignorance or passion, but of cold calculation and careful planning. It was evil refined to its purest form, cruelty elevated to an art, and murder dressed in the robes of divine justice. Her story reminds us that the greatest horrors in human history are often committed not by obvious monsters, but by ordinary people who have convinced themselves that their victims deserve whatever suffering is inflicted upon them. The trial and execution of Joan of Arc stands as perhaps history's most chilling example of how evil can flourish when it disguises itself as righteousness. What makes her punishment truly horrifying is not just the flames that consumed her 19-year-old body, but the systematic perversion of every institution that should have protected her. The church became her prosecutor, the law became her executioner, and scholarship became the architect of her destruction. Joan's story serves as an eternal warning about the darkest capabilities of human nature. It shows us that the most monstrous acts in history are rarely committed by obvious villains, but by educated, civilized people who convince themselves that their cruelty serves a noble cause. Her judges believed they were saving Christianity while committing one of the most unchristian acts imaginable. They transformed justice into vengeance and faith into a weapon of political murder. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized Joan as a saint, finally acknowledging what history had already proven. The peasant girl burned as a heretic had become a symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming evil. Her persecutors, who tried so desperately to erase her from history, instead ensured that her story would echo through the centuries as a testament to the power of unshakable conviction against institutional corruption.